grab a cup of hot cocoa, tea, or booze, no judgments here, because it's time for another installment of Gone Too Soon, the program where we celebrate and reminisce-abrate over some of the most talented and unfortunately least existing video game studios. We first covered bizarre creations from the UK, then traveled to Japan to give Clover their due, but now we're returning back to the Commonwealth with Canada and Vancouver, British Columbia's Radical Entertainment. Formed in 1991 by seasoned vets Rory Arms, Dave Davis, and industry newcomer Ian Wilkinson, Radical's 28-year history makes it one of the longest-running Canadian developers of all time. And I'm just going to jump straight ahead right now. It's not technically shut down, but merely a husk of its former self for reasons we'll get into. But first, let's go back through Radical's early output because it was, shall we say, varied. Specifically, their first titles were either inoffensive or very much offensive, depending on who you'd ask. This includes things like The Adventures of Rocky and Bullwinkle, The Terminator, Mario is Missing, Wayne's World, Beavis and Butthead, Mario's Time Machine, and in 1996, Welcome to Earth, the only game based on Independence Day. Aside from their quality, you can probably see another common thread between each one. They were all licensed IPs. In fact, Radical worked with existing franchises for much of their history, something they would embrace and eventually excel at. The 1990s, however, did have a few other bright spots, a duo of well-received Brett Hull hockey titles, as well as another PlayStation effort known as Grid Runner. God, I remember seeing this box art a lot in the 90s for some reason. Grid Runner was a neat isometric tag-like game whose main draw was the multiplayer, and while not a 5-star classic, it showed that Radical could transition to 3D rather smoothly. It was also one of their very few early efforts at original IP. For the next few years, they seemed content with producing a number of sports games, including MTV Sports, Snowboarding, NBA Basketball 2000, NHL Championship, MTV Sports Pure Ride, ESPN X Games Pro Border, and NBHLA Balls of Competition. Now, there's a good chance many of you haven't heard of any of these titles. Why? Well, they're not Madden, or 2K, or even Nintendo Sports if you remember those, but rather fell under the Fox Sports Interactive brand, which was about as short-lived as you'd expect. This, however, wouldn't be the last time Fox Interactive and Radical would cross paths. It was only until 2000 where the old knuckleheads put out one of their weirdest, unlikeliest dips into the licensed world. This was Jackie Chan's Stunt Master. While the martial arts megastar was a big name in other parts of the world, he was just breaking through in America with Rush Hour and Shanghai Noon when this game came out. To make this fun, light-hearted romp, Jackie worked directly with Radical, lending his voice as well as providing motion capture for the crazier scenarios. While obviously not a blockbuster, Stunt Master was overflowing with charm, and is an oddball title that is still fondly remembered. The very next year, Radical moved on to the 6th generation of consoles with Dark Summit, another brand new IP that took a different tack within the exploding genre of extreme sports. It was more of a narratively driven action-adventure with snowboarding as its core. I don't know if I'm alone on this, but I remember seeing this game everywhere. Used game bins, rental stores, specialty shops, etc. It just seems so super common. It was published by THQ, so that explains that. While a neat idea, I'm assuming it was a financial failure as we never saw anything approaching a sequel. And oddly enough, Dark Summit also marked Radical's return to Nintendo hardware after skipping the N64's entire life cycle altogether. 2001 was also a year where Radical would cement its reputation as a reliable developer to make your licensed thing a thing. Simpsons Road Rage was released on the Xbox, PS2, and GameCube, and not gonna sugarcoat it, it's just Crazy Taxi. In fact, it's so Crazy Taxi that Sega sued Electronic Arts for this blatant copyright violation. That being said, being able to drive around open districts within Springfield, interacting with characters with their authentic voiceovers, had a definite appeal. Now, while certainly not a Game of the Year contender, Road Rage was a turning point for Simpsons games, as the last two, Huh, what? Skateboarding? And Jesus, why wrestling? Were certainly dark periods for the franchise. Therefore, Road Rage having above average reviews and being available on all current gen consoles made it a big hit for both Radical and bolstered their standing just a bit. 2002 was an eclectic year for the company, releasing 3 games in 3 very different genres. Tetris Worlds was released on just about everything, with Radical having worked on the GameCube and Xbox versions. This was a slightly different take on the Russian block stacking phenomenon, as it featured a story mode, first for the series. While receiving average reviews, Tetris Worlds was another big success, with multiple versions all selling close to 1 million copies. Next was Radical's first foray with Disney, with Monsters Incorporated Scream Arena, which just so happened to be a GameCube exclusive because, you know, the GameCube.
We put a handle on Nintendo GameCube so it could be carried around.
It was more of a mini-game compilation, and while no great shakes, showed that they could make product for the younger set, and man, that box art sure is lazy. Finally, they closed out 2002 with James Cameron's Dark Angel. Wow, just got hit by 2,000 years worth of nostalgia. This was a surprisingly solid stealth action game based on the short-lived Jessica Alba vehicle. It sported remarkable production quality with its graphics, story, and voice acting, featuring just about everyone from the show, including Miss Alba herself.
I'm going after her.
Gameplay, however, had some issues, featuring some inconsistent stealth mechanics, and was deemed as somewhat repetitive by critics. Still though, you'd think something like this would be a lot worse. From here on out though, Radical would start hitting their stride, putting out their best, most fondly remembered games that truly show what they were capable of when paired with the appropriate franchise. In 2003, they found a new publishing partner in Vivendi Universal, which at the time owned a lot of shit. Video game, TV, and movie licenses, you name it, they could get it. This actually turned out to be a perfect fit, as Radical had so much experience working with franchises to begin with, making them an easy choice to handle the upcoming glut of projects. Following the success of Activision's Spider-Man games came Hulk. Just Hulk in 2003. Based on the ambitious but clunky Ang Lee film, it did a lot of interesting things for a superhero game at the time. It featured 2 distinct styles of gameplay: stealth and puzzles with Bruce Banner, because he's a nerd, and action platforming with the Jade Giant, because he's Smash. The game also employed a cel-shaded look, giving it a unique flair even if it didn't fit with the film's visual style. It also functioned as a sequel to the movie, even including the horrible Hulk dogs that nobody likes. Now, despite being based on the film's continuity, it featured lots of comic book staples like additional costumes, more villains, etc. And maybe due to the hype of the burgeoning superhero genre, the success of the game led to Radical getting similar work and proved that Hulk's power set was a great fit for 3D action adventures. Their last game of 2003 would be something that many fans point to as one of the finest examples of video games based on pre-existing IP. Simpsons Hit and Run was released by Vivendi Universal, no EA this time, and delivered on the potential seen in Road Rage, featuring a fully open world Springfield where you can drive from Evergreen Terrace to the nuclear power plant all the way to the try and save, whilst causing untold mayhem along the way. The story, while certainly very video gamey, had Mr. Burns assaulting the sleepy town with radio-controlled B-bots, with every member of the Simpsons clan trying to stop his nefarious scheme.
Or what? You'll release the dogs, or the bees, or the dogs with bees in their mouth, and when they bark they shoot bees at you? Well, go ahead!
While Road Rage was limited in its gameplay style, Hit and Run was a massive step up that really let you explore and interact with Springfieldians for the first time. When people think of good Simpsons games, Hit and Run is usually the first that comes to mind.
Video games don't kill people, they just kill their minds.
That's not to say it was perfect, however. Despite it being released in a time where the technique was being widely used in both prior Simpsons games and even in Radical's own Hulk, Hit and Run did not employ cel shading, which would have done wonders to replicate the look of the show. Instead, it was more 3D Homer from that Treehouse of Horrors episode. It was also on the short side for an open world title, and while it couldn't offer the depth of Rockstar's offerings, was a huge step up in fleshing out the nuclear family in video game form. 2004 was a pretty quiet year for the company, and by quiet year, I mean it was the first year they didn't put out anything since its founding. Yes, Radical put out something every year up until 2004, which has to be some kind of record. Fortunately, this was due to the fact that they were preparing a wave of titles that would push them even further, and is considered the company's high watermark of output. In 2005, Radical was purchased by Vivendi Universal, and with no movie having to adhere to, they released The Incredible Hulk Ultimate Destruction on the PS2, GameCube, and Xbox. Now, while their first Hulk game didn't quite live up to the lofty heights set by the Night Monkey,
Yeah.
Ultimate Destruction sure did. Featuring Radical's second attempt at an open world structure, they absolutely nailed the idea of going anywhere and doing anything, all whilst having the Hulk's powers at your beck and call. Crushing cars to form metal gauntlets, wrestling maneuvers, surfing via destroyed buses, using tanks as clubs, reflecting missiles back at enemies, huge boss fights, running up buildings, jumping across city blocks. If you wanted to do something in Ultimate Destruction, you could. Simply one of the best superhero action games available on that generation of consoles, and deserves to be talked about in the same breath as Spider-Man or the Arkham games. Working with Vivendi Universal, like I mentioned earlier, Radical were handed franchises they might otherwise not had been considered for, and one of those was Crash Bandicoot. Crash Tag Team Racing, a sequel to the kart racing spin-off, was released for all three consoles as well as the PSP, and was an admirable attempt to pick up where Naughty Dog had left off. One reason why it wasn't as warmly received as its predecessor is that the game originally began at Traveler's Tales, before being permanently sent to the Lego pits, but was then dumped onto Radical at some point in mid-development, which probably led to the game feeling somewhat underwhelming. The next year, in a big departure from Crash, came another open world game, and one of their best, in Scarface: The World Is Yours. Leveraging Vivendi Universal's reach within Hollywood, this was a GTA clone through and through, but a damn good one at that. It's a stroke of marketing genius to try and sway all those 20-something-year-olds with posters of Tony Montana in their dorm rooms by going, "It's GTA, but you're Scarface!" The World Is Yours was a what-if sequel to the 1979 film, where Tony simply doesn't die at the end of the climactic shootout, spoilers, but lives to snort coke another day. With the cops having confiscated all his loot and tigers,
Can I buy a tiger from this thing?
Tony then needs to rebuild his empire from scratch and get his revenge on those cockroaches who crossed him. While not having the legendary actor in the iconic role, Mr. Pacino did personally select a sound-alike to portray him, who does a really awesome job.
Hey, what you talking about?
Radical went with this what-if/sequel story as they felt they wouldn't be able to do the film justice in game form, and felt it better to break away to have more free reign. They even approached the original screenwriter, Oliver Stone, to write the script, which he unfortunately declined. However, the job then passed on to one David McKenna, who wrote both American History X and Blow, which is a pretty good resume. Scarface was a wonderful Miami-based sandbox featuring tons of missions to take on, side activities, property management, and was ludicrously violent and lewd.
You're a good girl, baby. Don't make me spank you.
Just like everything based on Scarface should be. It was released on the PS2, Xbox, PC, but skipped the GameCube in lieu of a Wii port that used the IR pointer for more precise aiming. The game would go on to sell well more than 1 million copies, and an Xbox 360 version was also in the cards before being unceremoniously cancelled. More on that later. Oh god, more on that later. They then returned to Crash once again with Crash of the Titans, which was marginally better received than Traveler's Tales' last entry, which was Crash Twinsanity if you're keeping track at home. The Bandicoot shelf life had long since come and gone, so this made Titans one of the more forgettable Radical titles of the day. But wait, there's more! One final Crash game was released the very next year, which was Crash Mind Over Mutant for the Xbox 360 and Wii, with the PlayStation 3 version being left out for some reason. It implemented a co-op feature and had more of a free-roaming gameplay feel, but like Crash himself, was largely ignored. following the Bandicoot's then last hurrah, something important happened. Vivendi and Activision merged along with some snow company, I don't know. And during this, Radical became 100% wholly owned by the warm and loving mega conglomerate. What occurred almost immediately is that a number of Radical employees were let go, with one project in particular being cancelled altogether. That project was Scarface 2, or Scarface 3 technically, never mind. Radical had started work on this sequel hot off the heels of the first game's success. It was apparently very far along before Activision pulled the plug because Activision. The rest of Radical then started working on their first big next-gen game, which was to be a brand new IP utilizing all they had learned in the fine art of open world anarchy. That of course being Prototype. Taking a distinctly more dark approach than any of their previous titles, Prototype was a superhero action game spectacle centering around viral outbreaks, unbridled carnage, and the iconic hoodie of Alex Mercer, all contained within the bustling streets of New York City. Building off of Ultimate Destruction, Prototype had you slamming into vehicles with reckless abandon, running up walls, throwing missiles back at tanks, and etc. and etc. While they were very independently developed, Prototype found itself being often compared to Infamous, Sony's very similar superhero title, which wound up releasing less than 2 weeks before Prototype, which definitely cut into its potential sales on the PS3 at least. Fortunately though, the game performed well enough in the end, going on to selling more than 2 million copies worldwide. While they were prototyping Prototype, another project that Radical had been working on, another Crash game called Crash Landed, was also cancelled. There was going to be a DS version by way of Renegade Kid, with Radical handling the consoles. While there's no footage of Radical's work, the premise had Crash being mutated by Cortex and needed to save other Bandicoots as the main gameplay loop. It's unknown why it was cancelled, but the entire Crash team was laid off by Activision for good measure, I guess, with the remainder of the studio told to prioritize a Prototype sequel. Said sequel, Prototype 2, was released on the Xbox 360 and PS3 and would be, in terms of budget, Radical's biggest game, but instead of featuring Alex Mercer, a new character would be doing the prototyping. James Heller. He was a soldier who blamed Alex for the death of his family, hence the Heller versus Mercer marketing campaign. This was seen as a bit of a risk, changing the series' protagonist, but it was refreshing to see a sequel actually take a risk, unlike most typical Activision fare. Despite more money having been spent, Prototype 2 wound up being divisive among the fanbase, having many improvements but just as many flaws when compared to the original game. Also, the inclusion of RadNet, a sort of in-game digital storefront which provides small pieces of DLC, probably didn't help. Activision had advertised that pre-ordering Prototype 2 or buying the game's first package run would reward the player with 55 pieces of micro DLC, garbage like Xbox avatar items, themes, as well as some in-game bonuses, which might have left a sour taste in some gamers' mouths. All that aside, the game was still another great effort from Radical, featuring the same visceral combat, conspiracy-laden storyline, and open-world destruction fans had come to expect. It was released at the tail end of April 2012, which wasn't exactly a slow month. The Darkness 2, Binary Domain, Witcher 2, Assassins of Kings on the 360, and the very first episode of The Walking Dead, all released within 2 weeks of each other. Because of this, Prototype 2 unfortunately wound up being the best-selling game of the month? Yeah, despite the competition including holdovers from previous months like Call of Duty and Mass Effect 3, James Heller's Quest for Revenge was a success sales-wise, although a bit slower than its predecessor. While I can't find hard sales data, the title did go on to sell more than 1 million copies, and by some reports crossed the 2 million threshold eventually. That wasn't good enough, it seems, so less than 2 months later, the Grim Reaper gave his edict. Although we made a substantial investment in the Prototype IP, it did not find a broad commercial audience. Radical is a very talented team of developers, however, we have explored various options for the studio, including a potential sale of the business, and have made a difficult conclusion through the consultation process that the only remaining option is a significant reduction in staff. As such, some employees will remain working for Radical Entertainment, supporting other existing Activision publishing projects, but the studio will cease development of its own games going forward. So yeah, ever since then, no games have come from the studio, but it technically still exists today, their last known contributions going towards the original Destiny in 2014. Only one of Radical's original founders stayed with the company up to this point, David Davis, who then departed that same year once Destiny was finished. This one hurts, you guys. While Clover's spirit lives on in Platinum, there's very few studios, especially in Canada, that exemplify what Radical did. Action-packed, accessible games that could capture the essence of any licensed IP and make them fun, and even more often than that, were actually quite good. You felt the love that they put into their titles, whether they be superheroes, cartoon characters, or edgy hoodie-clad assholes. What's more is that they were so close to really breaking through a prototype and were on the precipice of getting to that AAA studio level. And while they may not have achieved that via the usual measuring sticks of success like units sold, they'll still be remembered as a AAA studio for their unbridled talent. Know of any other fantastic studios that are no longer with us? Well, let me know in the comments below. I'll dig a bit into their history so we can celebrate them on the next episode of Gone Too Soon.